Dear colleagues and friends, I think it was 6 p.m. Tuesday, October 29, 2015, at the Kampala Serena Hotel, when I last shared a public platform with Hope Chivenjere, who tragically passed on this week. On that day, the intergenerational debate brought us together, some of the most surviving founder members of the movement from Fronasa days and the young generation today. I used then that occasion to metaphorically paint the picture of a relay athlete who has to run fast, but in a very disciplined manner to win. Yet he or she has to carefully ensure that the baton in his hand is passed on safely and diligently to the next person, making both the receiver and the giver of the baton responsible for the final success of the race. Hope Chivenjere, in a very surprise move to me, she took to the microphone and supported the position I had taken. She narrated the journey Uganda had been through in the dark days of Idi Amin, when she was pulled out of her dormitory with others and paraded by security forces, and some disappeared. Some of her colleagues disappeared. She gave credit to the change we have today in the country, the change in fortunes for Uganda, for better, and she cautioned us to the debilitating disease of complacency. She concurred with my argument about the urgent need for internal, legal, political, and moral reform of the movement in order to bring about the necessary rejuvenation for the long journey ahead. Hope displayed her quintessential, subtle, yet very strong warrior qualities that made her attractive to those who worked with her. Always looking younger than her actual age, this thin, chocolate-skinned, beautiful daughter of an evangelist, Hope, she carried a romantic voice that tended towards baritone, as if she was a bass singer. She was stoically firm, especially when she didn't like something. She combined qualities of a warrior and a woman of integrity with her roots in the faith of her parents. Nicknamed Chande, which is a malt-colored, in English, a malt-colored brown thrasher songbird that carries a majestic repertoire of 2,400 songs in its little beak. She was named by her parents that name on account of her loquaciousness, her talkativeness. Hope came from a pedigree of African resistors against invasion of any form, both internal and external. I think it is from this soil that she built this independent spirit. For example, in history, at the Battle of Kagogo, about 1893 in Kebison sub-county today, in which Ntare V of Nkore was desperate for cattle, given the devastating rinderpest in his kingdom, the forces of Nkore, led by Princes Rugumayo, Rwajuka, and Igumira, they led a force called Abatahunga of Nkore. They faced off with Rujumbura's fiercest fighting force under King Makobore. Rujumbura's forces were commanded by a man called Miranda ya Rwabogo Nyamwigarra Manengo, who was Hope's maternal grandfather. This praise name meant, and I quote, the ferocious one who closes in on caves and fights on rocks and cliffs. The other man under Miranda was Simeon Karukubiro, who is the father of the former ambassador of Uganda to the UN, Perez Kamnanwire, now I think about 84. The other man with Hope's grandfather was called Festo Rukumbyana, who's the father of Francis Gureme, who was the old man about town writing in the Monitor till recently. The other man was called Kacheshero, the grandfather of Reverend Kacheshero of Chitara Church, who died recently. Rujumbura, with its mountainous, well-watered plateaus rising up to 6,000 feet and surrounded by the river complexes, the river complex of Minera, Kahenje, Rubabo, and Nchwera, Rujumbura had very good natural defenses and it defeated Nkore in this battle that I mentioned. The kingdom, as we know, stayed safe from both the colonial agents from Buganda and the whites who were colonizing the country for a little longer. They stayed safe. But really the point I'm trying to make is that much of this work of defense can be credited to the greatest fighter of Rujumbura, who was called Miranda, who is Hope's grandfather. Miranda had a private armory of 10 rifles, an assortment of all sorts of battle equipment, from spears to bows and arrows. He had a band of men, a party of men who continued to raid deep into Butumbi. Butumbi is the old name of DRC from the Ankole side. They continued to raid Butumbi well into the mid-1920s. This practice in Ankole, we used to call it Orhendo, which meant private raid. Fearing that Miranda would rebel against them, the colonial government made him a Gomboro chief as an appeasement ploy to keep him in check. Hope's parents, this was Hope's grandparents, but Hope's parents were polar opposite of her grandfather's character, but they were fighters of another kind nevertheless. Bishop Festo and Canon Merab Chivenjere, this couple led the East African Christian revival movement across Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, and they preached alongside the famous American evangelist who died recently, Billy Graham. Bishop Chivenjere led the fight against Idi Amin with his unique form of weapon, which he called forgiveness, and he called this specifically loving Idi Amin. Hope Chande would take up this fight in her own time when she became mature. She became an active member of the early resistance against bad leadership, against dictatorship, and helped communicate very well the movement's ideals when she was in exile in Nairobi in the 1980s with her colleagues. Now, many of you really know that often the children who stand in large shoes of their parents and grandparents, as Hope did, can be crudely denied by circumstances and perception their own voice, their own character, and their own contribution to the country. But not Hope. I know this because when I began to work as a part-time reporter while I was at university, and eventually in the Constituent Assembly that worked on Uganda's constitution in the 1990s, I was surprised by the respect and decorum with which editors and reporters across the spectrum, both opposition press and government press, I was surprised by the decorum that was accorded to her calls, yet she was neither forceful nor aggressive in any threatening way. She was always humble, she was always professional, but most importantly, she was very particular with the quality of stories from the presidency. She sought out the story's factuality. She looked at the diction of the writers to ensure the accuracy of information given by the office of the president. She cared very much about the weight and dignity of her boss's office. Now, I found it rather odd, as a young reporter, that she would never go against activistic reporters, of which I was partly one, especially when she understood the motivation and the heart of a reporter. Now, the older me, I cannot recall very clearly all the faces in that humid heat in a room in a mid-morning press event at Nakasero State Lodge, somewhere in mid-1998. But I suspect Hope was in that room. In that room on that day, that morning, I asked, when I took to the microphone, the former president of Burkina Faso, Blaise Compaoré, who had visited Uganda, I took to the microphone and asked him who killed his friend and compatriot, Thomas Sankara. This question was deemed embarrassing by the host, but Hope remained in her seat, very unmoved, as long as I stayed to the facts, the mood in the room notwithstanding. Hope also never found any question intrusive. She was open to those who sought to learn from her, because I know one morning I called her asking about the meaning of her father's name, the name Chivenjere, or Chivengere as it was written. I told her I had been reflecting on why and how a parent would name a child Chivenjere in the year 1919, after the First World War, when her father was born. I had searched among the Wahaya, the Wanyambo, the Bajinja of northwestern Tanzania, the Wachiga of southwestern Uganda, the Banyarwanda, the Banyankore, and the Baganda people groups. All these people groups, I kept searching and I couldn't find this name Chivengere anywhere. I told her when we spoke that I suspected the name was a misspelled version of Lavegerie, or maybe in French they pronounce it as Lavegiha. This Lavegerie man was the French cardinal who in 1868 formed the Missionaries d'Afrique. This group aimed at sending missionaries to Africa specifically to convert kings and queens and their courtiers as their strategy for spreading their brand of Christianity. This group, some of you might know, was the source of the White Fathers, who was named so because the priests they wore flowing white robes. This group arrived in Uganda in 1879. They eventually settled in Masaka, from where they moved and set base in a place I think called Katoke in Rwanda in 1900. But that a father would name a son after a missionary of the rival faith was not very clear to me, if my hypothesis were to stand. Bishop Festo Chivengere's father's name was also very exotic and remote to me. It complicated my discussion with Hope. Her paternal grandfather, Bishop Chivengere's father, was called Ntsizira. Now, Hope and I agreed to research this question further. Sadly, she has left me with no answers. In the end, Hope's nonconformist style, her unrelenting rejection of the bandwagon mentality, her search for meaning in life, her full understanding of our society, her simplicity, all these attributes carry very good lessons for young people today. A few weeks ago, before she went to Zambia as part of the election observers team from COMESA, she called me to look at the first chapter of a book she was writing in Runyankore about her mother, Mrs. Merab Nyinenzanji Chivengere. I asked Hope why she would write this book for a small audience of Runyachitara readers, given the fact that her parents had a global reach, and Hope said she needed to keep the story of her mother as it was told to her in 2006 in the local language. She said this would perhaps push some of the young people to learn what she called Ruhororo and its roots. Now, Hope's quiet yet very impactful disposition reminds me of a little-known yet effective man called Clark Clifford during the U.S. Truman's presidency in 1948. And the story goes that there were deep divisions at the time over whether the U.S. government would recognize the state of Israel as the British mandate over Palestine came to an end on May 16, 1948. And these divisions threatened to bring down the government. This is because America was dependent on Middle Eastern oil for her growing industry, and supporting the Jewish state would alienate the industrial classes on which the country depended to fight Soviet Union in that bitter Cold War of the time. The US military leaders of the Second World War opposed this decision, and among them, a very popular one, General George Marshall, who had a stronger national footprint than the President Truman. Exasperated about this decision, Truman turned to a silent but very well-read, impartial domestic advisor. His name was Clark Clifford. Clark Clifford, being apolitical, he painted a clearer picture for the president of the symbiotic relationship between Middle Eastern oil Arab countries and their need for markets in a strong growing economy in North America for their own economic growth, He showed Truman that to support Israel would allow the US and all the other countries in the West to put a democratic state in the Near East, a state that the US could work with to save millions of Jewish refugees. Truman listened carefully. That evening, Truman picked Clifford's advice against that of all his generals, and he went on air the same evening and announced American support for the creation of Israel. Now, 73 years later, some of the top military, industrial, technology firms in America all have their roots in Israeli brain power and innovation. And what more, the trade between Israel and the US stands at United States $47 billion as of 2019, before COVID-19 lockdowns. The moral of this story is this, that often the most effective people are not the ones that make so much noise. They are not the ones who show off their power. It is the seemingly unspectacular, the untheatrical, the institution builders that the common person on the street does not see daily. It is those people whose contribution our country hinges on. Hope Chande Chivenjeri most ably represented that segment of our society. I will miss her dearly. May the Lord bless her soul and give her eternal peace.